can stylometry prove that Jesus, or even Paul, didn't exist? Well, the short answer is no, yet that is the main focus in the book Christ Before Jesus, a work that tries to further the Jesus myth case. Now, as a former mythicist myself, someone who accepted the conclusion that Jesus was a mythical figure, the argument was rather intriguing as it's something rather new, it's novel. When looking at the various cases that mythicists make, the topic of stylometry doesn't really appear, nor do most even reject Paul. They simply accept that he was a historical figure. However, stylometry, or simply saying the study of linguistic style, is not new when it comes to the New Testament studies. So what are we to make of Matthew Britt's and Jaaron Wingo's, the authors of Christ Before Jesus, arguments? To cover their entire argument, I will first look at their methodology and results in regards to their stylometric experiments. By showing major flaws in both, I will show how many of their conclusions are not supported, and thus we can actually deal with the history itself. After going through their base arguments, I will return to the topic of stylometry and how it can be applied to New Testament studies properly. Because of the size of this endeavor, I will be breaking this into a series so that it's a lot more easily digestible. So let's jump in and look at the major flaws in Christ Before Jesus. So now before we even get into their chapters on stylometry, which are chapters 7 and 8, we already run into a couple of problems. That problem really being how they market their book. They make the bold claim that, quote, Christ Before Jesus presents a first-of-its-kind analysis using proven, peer-reviewed mathematics and software which reveals a second-century origin for the books of the New Testament, unquote. There are a few problems with this, though. First, what they are doing is not really a first-of-its-kind analysis. Even in their book, they make the claim that computerized stylometric analysis of the New Testament dates back to Anthony Kenny and his work, A Stylometric Study of the New Testament. This work was published in 1986. However, as with a lot of their history, they don't get this correct. So, 2 decades earlier, Andrew Q. Morton, who was a pioneer in stylometry, had begun using a computer to run stylometric studies. Now, the first mention of this is in 1963, where he makes mention of the test that he ran on the computer at the University of Edinburgh. Now, granted, this was just an article that was published in a British newspaper, and it just detailed what Morton had been working on. But by 1965, he was giving lectures at colleges on this subject. And in 1971, he published the book, It's Greek to the Computer, along with A.D. Winspear. By the time of Britt's and Wingo's writing, at least 6 decades of research has already gone into this subject, and that's just counting studies that utilize computers. The study of stylometry in general dates back to at least 1890 with the publication of Principes di Stylometrii by Polish philosopher Wincenty Lutosławski. Yet even this work is just a place historians point to when discussing when the basic ideas of stylometry were set out. What are we to make of this claim that Christ Before Jesus is the first of its kind analysis then? Obviously, it's not the first computational stylometric analysis of Pauline authorship or of the New Testament. On page 207, and just to be clear, I'm using their Kindle version of their book, they do mention that the majority of stylometric analysis on the, quote, New Testament texts makes the assumption that looking at them alongside 2nd century texts would be of no avail, unquote. This, though, suggests a misunderstanding of what stylometry is. Why would such analysis want to include 2nd century text? Stylometry is not used to date texts. So unless one has a potential match for an author coming out of the 2nd century, adding 2nd century text would factually be of little to no avail. After all, stylometry really is used to determine the common authorship, or even conversely, forgery. It's not used to date texts. Now, maybe they're referring to the idea that this analysis is meant to reveal that the New Testament text originated in the 2nd century. Again, though, that's not what stylometry is used for. It's not used for dating texts. It's used in regards to authorship. Unless they can reveal who the true author of these texts are, that there are all 2nd century authors that we have writings from that we can be compared to, their goal here is simply out of the realm of what stylometry can do. Finally, maybe what they are referring to here as being a first of its kind is that they break the text of the New Testament into chapter lengths, and then they run multiple analyses on that, which may be true, but it also shows a misunderstanding of what stylometry can achieve. In order to achieve a quality analysis, the more information one has, the better. This tends to be true in most fields. Now, Matthew Britt O'Donnell, in his book, Designing and Compiling a Register-Balanced Corpus of Hellenistic Greek for the Purpose of Linguistic Description and Investigation, breaks down the size of the corpus that is really needed for various analysis. They break this down into 3 categories. Tense form distribution, which needs around 2,000 words. Word order distribution, which needs about 20,000 words. And vocabulary, needing about 20 million words within that corpus. When talking about Paul, looking at the 7 largely undisputed letters, those being Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon, we get around 30,000 words total, and that's just in the English. This would allow us to run word order analysis, but it's still a far cry from determining the author's possible vocabulary. To make matters worse, a good portion of that word count comes from just 2 books, Romans and 1st Corinthians. Looking at individual chapters, some, when we're actually looking at the Greek text here, are less than 200 words. To be fair, Britt and Wingo do recognize that there is a limit, as they explain in chapter 7, how 2nd and 3rd John are just too short, so they had to combine them when running their analysis. And while they don't give us a breakdown of how they divide the chapters in the Pauline corpus, they do imply that some chapters were in fact merged. But this lack of transparency in their methodology will come into play later. Now, after having some email exchanges with Britt and Wingo, it is this aspect that they claim to be a first of its kind analysis. But as already mentioned, there is a reason why such an analysis hasn't been ran before. It simply is not accurate, because there just is not enough data. The results simply cannot be trusted, and we'll dive more into that in just a little bit. The second issue with their marketing is that it is misleading. They use the phrase peer-reviewed, which seems to give some weight to their argument. But what are they claiming is peer-reviewed? It isn't their study or anything regards to that, but the software that they are using, which is Stylometry with R or simply Stylo. Stylo is one of a few different stylometric programs that you can freely download at home. Other ones are Signature by Peter Milliken at Oxford University and the Java Graphical Authorship Attribution Program, or GJAAP, by Patrick Jula. And these really are the primary ones. There are other programs that you can use, but when we're looking at ones that can be freely downloaded at home, these 3 really stand out. And when we look at Stylo, it does show a lot of great promise. The issue, though, is that whether Stylo is peer-reviewed or not, it doesn't reflect on the studies done using Stylo. Just because Stylo is a legitimate tool, it doesn't mean that the work done with Stylo is legitimate. This will instead depend on how one uses Stylo, what methodology is practiced. As we will see, the methodology that Britt and Wingo use is not effective, and thus their results are not accurate, nor should they be taken seriously. It doesn't matter that they use peer-reviewed software for this, their results still are not accurate. And we can see how there's already problems with their methodology. So for instance, as I've already mentioned, the text lengths that they propose are just way too short to provide any reliable information. Third and final, as mentioned already, Stylometry does not provide the ability to date text. This is not a function of stylometric analysis. That being so, it is not possible for the mathematics and software that they're using to reveal that the New Testament text originated in the 2nd century. The entire premise here is one that is based on a faulty foundation, yet it is put forth with a great amount of confidence. And if we have to say anything about Britt and Wingo, is that they have a lot of confidence. But having a lot of confidence doesn't excuse for poor research. Moving on, this idea that the New Testament text originated in the 2nd century also poses a different issue. Both in private correspondence as well as in their public TikTok videos, Britt and Wingo falsely imply that there's a movement to redate the New Testament text into the 2nd century. While in our correspondence, they mention the recent work by Dr. Nina Livesey, this in no way suggests a shift in the general scholarship. Livesey, in this regard, is an outlier. To put it simply, Britt and Wingo are overplaying their hand. Now, to be fair, there are a couple other scholars who take this 2nd century dating as well, but the scholarship hasn't been very well received, and it simply is not changing views within mainstream scholarship. So, yes, you do have these outliers within the scholarship of New Testament studies, but that doesn't mean that there's a movement going away from the traditional dating. So, now that was a good deal of discussion based on a single claim, yet I think it was important in order to demonstrate a couple of key issues that their book, Christ Before Jesus, has. First, it implies that Britt and Wingo have a flawed view as to what can be accomplished with stylometry, as well as its limits. And second, it shows a clear overstatement and overconfidence in their position. These are two ideas that we will need to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, what about their methodology? While Britt and Wingo spend the entirety of Chapter 7 on their methodology, not much detail is actually given, but we can glean some things that are stated directly, as well as a few things that are implied. To begin, Britt and Wingo do get some of the basics about stylometry correct, but part of the reason they get those details correct is because they are rather vague. They briefly touch on ideas, but they never really dive in, which may hint at their lack of comprehension here. One could also suggest that this vagueness may just be a byproduct of Britt and Wingo not having formal training or education in regards to publishing research. While both are possibly true, the latter isn't necessarily a negative reflection on the actual study. The issue that arises, though, is that there is a lack of details. For instance, on page 208, they discuss their methodology a bit. They mention that they found Eater's delta and Eater's simple delta formulas to, quote, provide us with the most reliable results when looking at Greek texts of varied lengths from antiquity, unquote. They make the claim that most reliable here, quote, means most accurate and likely to attribute texts correctly, unquote. This is based on tests that they ran on Greek texts. But they don't tell us what Greek texts they ran, what methodology they used or built from those tests, the lengths of those. They figured out that either formula was more accurate. They also don't state what formula, either Eater's delta or Eater's simple delta, that they ended up settling on. Now, granted, both formulas are rather similar, and they are derived from John Burrell's delta formula, which is really a standard. But if they're switching between the two formulas, that can influence the data, allowing for manipulation. It also removes transparency, which is necessary if, as the authors claim, they welcome people to try to replicate their tests. Without detailing their methodology, or even specifying what formula they are using, replication is virtually impossible. Britt and Wingo also make the claim that they tailored their approach specifically to Greek texts from around 200 BC to 300 AD, yet they don't explain how they accomplished this and what that specifically even means. Even though they don't go into detail, we can be certain that part of their methodology here and the approach that they had tailored does not take genre into account. This is certain as on page 211 they state that Stylo does not look at, quote, theme, theology, opinion, topic, or anything like that, unquote. They expand this on page 216 by arguing that Stylo doesn't detect genre, but looks at just authorship. That is patently false. In James Libby's 2015 dissertation, Disentangling Authorship and Genre in the Greek New Testament, Libby demonstrates how genre is predominant over authorship in stylistic studies. Libby was hardly the first one to discuss this issue, though. In Adrian S. Lindman's 1998 article, Correspondence Analysis of the Synoptic Gospels, he states very clearly that, quote, as far as the influence on language use is concerned, discourse type takes precedence over authorial preferences. Ignoring the discourse type factor in stylometry will almost invariably vitiate the outcomes, unquote. We can expand on this idea, though, and see that a variety of other factors can have an impact on stylometric analysis. Andrew Pitt's 2013 article, Style and Pseudonymity in Pauline Scholarship, not only reinforces the problem of genre, but also highlights 8 registers that affect style, and thus have to be accounted for in such studies. Everything, from the topic being discussed to whether the writing is formal or personal, will have an effect. Pitts goes on to also highlight that the shared knowledge that Paul and those he's writing to will have an impact on writing style and word choice. These are all things that have to be factored into a stylometric analysis. Now, following up in 2017, Pitts and Joshua Tyra, in exploring linguistic variation in an ancient Greek single author corpus, demonstrated how the style shift analysis that Pitts had previously developed in that 2013 paper actually worked with a single author. The article tested this method on Josephus and clearly showed a sizable stylistic shift in his own writings. Part of the reason for this shift was shown to be because of a change of genre as well as its subject matter. For instance, they saw a spike in the stylistic shift at Book 12 of Josephus's Antiquities. This is also what marks the end of the biblical material in Antiquities, and instead, Josephus moves on to more recent history. But quite possibly most telling here is that the creator of Stylo, Mythicism, in a 2017 paper titled Visualizations in Stylometry, highlights the fact that the authorial signal can be obscured by different signals or noise. One of those signals he mentions as being a major challenge is none other than genre. So what should be clear here then is that there are a whole host of factors that have to be kept in mind when performing such analyses. To claim that stylo or any stylometric process is blind to such factors is a serious misunderstanding which will have serious consequences in regards to any potential results. This misunderstanding continues to the manner in which they display their results, or test results in this case. In Chapter 7, Britt and Wingo display a number of results from the tests that they ran. Besides in one case, the metric part of the stylometrics was missing. Their graphs were missing the numbers. As in, the graphs were cropped in such a way as to remove the relevant distance scale, as well as all the other relevant material that would have been included, such as what formula was used, how many words were called, and how many of the most frequent words were actually used. The removal or lack of inclusion of this important information at best suggests that the authors have a severe misunderstanding of stylometric analysis, or at the worst, they're purposely manipulating the data. One hopes that the issue is simply ignorance, and in that case, we have to give them as much credit as possible. And that's the view I'm kind of taking throughout this series. Now, honestly, that may be a little generous, but in order to keep this review mature, that's the view I'm going to take as much as possible. So that's what I will leave off for this time. In the next video, we'll actually be looking at some of the problems that they say may arise, and we'll see just really how much they don't know about stylometry.